Sunnydale, as cheery as its name suggests, was not always sunny for the majority of its residents. One of them was Molly. She used to live with her parents in a house, and Molly wished for a happy family that would stick together, as any child would. She did, in fact, but not for long. The sunshine from her parents didn't last long because her mother moved out when they filed for a divorce. Molly loved spending time with her father. She enjoyed her time there. At the back of her father's house was a lake where she could go swimming or go fishing. The pond was like glass, reflecting the natural splendor. The leaves strewn about like confetti, creating a bright carpet on the ground. Molly relished every minute of her time with her father. When she was staying with him, she never felt lonely. He made certain that Molly was treated like the princess she is. Summer was soon ending, and Molly knew exactly whose car was it outside. Mom. Before the summer ends and school would begin, Molly would be picked up by her mom so she can stay with her for a while and spend some quality time together. Why can't I just stay here? Molly asked under her breath. It's not as if she doesn't want to be around her mother. It's just for the fact that various men turn up at her house every day as though they're having sleepovers. He's just a friend, she says. Molly's eyes rolled at the thought of it. She even recalled arriving at her mother's place and then seeing a shirtless man emerge from the shower. Molly was completely taken aback during that time. I don't care about your man, Stacy. I just don't like the thought that he lives in the same house as my daughter, her father said quietly, trying not to yell at her mother. George is just staying for a while. Then he'll go back to New York, her mom replied. Molly heard everything. Just as I thought, another man in the house. She said her goodbyes to her father and walked away with her mother. Throughout the journey, they were definitely quiet. Molly and her mother aren't particularly close, and Molly resented the concept of her mother abandoning her when she was only 5 years old. So, how was your summer so far? Her mom asked. It was fun, as usual. Molly responded coldly. Molly doesn't get it. She thought to herself that, why does her mother have to abandon her? Why did she chose the other person to accompany her? She was supposed to be Molly's role model, someone she could look up to. And who is this George character? Why can't she just stick to one guy? Molly internally got frustrated. We're here, her mom said. Great. Molly responded without a sign of gladness. Stacy's place had a river at the back too. It has crystal clear water and was abundant with fish. The house was a gift from Stacy's parents for their wedding. It was like summer every day for the three of them. Well, it used to be. Molly loves this place, and so did Stacy. Hey Mom, is the swing beside the river still there? Yes, honey. You can check it out if you want. Alright, I'll be inside soon. Molly immediately went to the river, reminiscing of the time when she begged her father to build a swing for her along the river. That was before her parents signed the divorce papers. Although every time she sees the water, seeing every flow and wave, she can feel it in her skin, finding it so peaceful. For her, it was pleasant and relaxing. She finally found her swing and sat on it, enjoying the cool breeze and aroma of the trees around her. The sky remained a brilliant blue, and the air caressed her bare arms. She was staring quietly across the river when something splashed from the water, as if something had fallen, or maybe emerged from it. She was alone in her swing, taking a breather before confronting her mother and her new boyfriend. This, though, startled her. An alligator? Her eyes widened, not because she thought it was an alligator, but rather it was another person rising and walking out from the water. What kind of an animal is he? A muscular man emerged from the water, shoulders broad, robust chest tapering to narrow hips, and he was completely undressed. Molly quickly covered her eyes and tried to claim she hadn't noticed anything. He, however, did. Molly heard the man giggle a little. Enjoying the view? Molly's face turned red like a ripe tomato. George is aware about his figure. He is quite a head-turner for girls. He already saw Molly while taking a swim and decided to introduce himself. He swam closer to Molly, and just as he expected, she was shocked to see his naked body. She yelled at him and accused him for trespassing in their private property. Oh? But I live here, George said as he was wrapping a towel on his waist. You what? Molly could not believe what she's hearing. Oh, you two met each other already. Her mom suddenly showed up. She must have heard her loud voice. Molly, this is George. George, this is Molly, my daughter. Molly couldn't take her eyes away from George. He was so attractive and perfectly tan too. Spread him with butter and jam and he'd be perfect for my breakfast, Molly thought. George and her mother went inside, leaving Molly in her posture, jaws clenched. Like a spying hawk, she followed them inside and examined both of them. George's hand was examining the back of her mother, and his eyes were fixated onto Stacy as if she was some sort of delicacy he couldn't wait to eat. Molly was perplexed. This vista was supposed to enrage her. She is nonetheless. But she began experiencing pleasure and desire. It's as if she too wants to be touched by George, who happens to be her soon-to-be stepfather. Hours went by, and the three of them planned on having lunch. Molly went inside her room, choosing some dresses and deciding which one is she going to wear for lunch. Wait, why am I dressing up? Molly had a flashback to George's body by the river. It sent thrills down her spine as she imagined herself in the icy water with him. Like a melody trapped in Molly's brain, the image of him naked stuck. She then chose a bright yellow dress to complement her pale skin and blonde hair. Molly was 17 years old, attractive, and very youthful. It's pretty clear from her mother's appearance where she received her beauty. Molly walked downstairs to assist with the lunch preparation. She noticed George in the kitchen, but her mother was not present. Where could she be? "Anything I can help you with?" she asked. George's face lit up by the sight of Molly. As George stared at the young girl, he was startled by her beauty. She's young and would be perfect for his plan. He noticed that the girl dressed up, and he's getting a hint that she's doing it for him. He smiled and asked Molly if she could handle a knife and not hurting herself in helping prepare the meal. "You wanna try me?" Molly was startled. Shit, that came out wrong. I mean, you wanna see me try? George considered that the attitude he was receiving was a go signal. Everything was all set for her mother. But then seeing Molly, he started to consider her this time. George's response was sly, with a grin on his face. He handed the salad to Molly and told her to toss it. He even slightly touched Molly's hand while handing the bowl of salad to her. She blushed, and George was happy to see that. They were both silent and concentrated on what they were doing in the kitchen while they prepared for the meal. Molly, on the other hand, can't seem to take her gaze away from George's figure. "Who cooks without a shirt? That should be illegal. This guy is so extra, damn," Molly thought. Now, isn't this a sight? Her mom entered the room holding a bottle of wine. George then took the bottle from her hands and kissed her in the forehead. Though Molly couldn't explain why was she longing for those things to happen to her. Seeing his lips slowly and passionately touching her mother's forehead, she thought it must have felt amazing. Then they all sat in the table and ate lunch. George fixed his eyes towards Molly the whole time. Every bite and smile from the girl sent chills to his body. A level of excitement he never felt towards Molly's mother. He was a gentleman in the eyes of Molly and Stacy, but deep inside, he was a drooling monster, craving for flesh and blood. "So, how did you two met?" "I know Mom doesn't go out much," Molly asked. "George works as a trainer at the gym that I go." "Your mom wanted to gain some weight, so I volunteered to train her," he explained. Though George's encounter with Stacy was not a coincidence. He first saw Stacy at a coffee shop. He overheard things like she's single and lives alone in her house in the middle of nowhere, and it sounded like a perfect situation. Attracting women like Stacy is not difficult for George. He stalked her almost every day, waiting for his opportunity to execute his plan. He saw her going to the gym, and since George had the toned body and young face, he used this as to finally begin his perfect plan. From that day on, he managed to execute everything until Molly arrived and changed everything. That explains the toned abs and muscular body, Molly thought. "How long were you seeing each other? You two seemed very close already." Molly continued asking. 6 months, I guess? Her mom answered and looked at George for validation. "Yeah, and we wanted the wedding to happen 4 months from now," George responded. Molly thought that everything was moving too quickly, and he started to seem wrong to her, as if he was concealing something strange, but then tried to forget about it and moved on with her meal. They finished their lunches and went about their separate activities. Molly was in her room, finishing her college application essays. She wanted to go to Harvard and become a lawyer one day. She was so focused on writing and refining the content that she became a little thirsty and walked downstairs to get a drink. She took a few steps towards the kitchen when she heard some familiar sounds. Something didn't feel right to her. She moved slowly and carefully, listening for murmurs, grunts, and heavy breaths. She leaned in for a closer look. Molly's jaw dropped and couldn't believe her eyes. George lifted up Stacy into the countertop. She was half undressed and so was George. Stacy's legs were spread out and George filled her in all of his glory. This was a day that George planned for quite some time. He was ready to devour Stacy. But then, someone interrupted them. George saw Molly's reflection in the knife beside Stacy. Molly took a second glance before dashing towards the stairs. George saw her and decided to check on her, and Stacy agreed. Molly was breathless when she came into her room. She directly jumped into her bed and hid beneath the sheets. George gently opened the door and checked on her a few seconds later. Molly feigned to sleep, and he quietly closed the door and went downstairs. Molly was taken aback by what she saw, but it also made her feel hot. Molly started to explore herself with her hand, from her breasts to her waist, legs, and down to her lady part. She began to rub it down there in circular motion. It gave her the adrenaline. She did it fast. She wanted to scream out the pleasure she's feeling. But she needed to keep quiet, or her mom and George will hear her. "Oh, George, you sly, hot creature." Molly did it fast and smooth, and leading her to a pleasurable ending. She was sweaty and wet everywhere. After that, she was weak and shaking. Molly instantly fell asleep. The next day, Molly was on the couch, munching on chips and watching a movie. When her mother entered the room, she sat with her legs crossed, relishing her salty yet luscious thinly cut potatoes. She asked Molly to look after George while she was gone. Molly's heart was pounding so loudly, because for a day, she and George were alone in the house. Her mother will be away at some meeting. "I'll be back tomorrow, okay, honey?" Molly tried to persuade her mother to decline, but it was too late. Her mother hurriedly gathered her belongings and loaded them into her car. She never gave the opportunity to refuse. Molly sadly agreed and wished her farewell. She stood there, watching as her mother drove away. The automobile vanished into the woods. She was stranded and didn't know what to do. She almost looked like an Ice Age mammoth. She kept watching the movie, and it kept her occupied for a while, and remembered to check up on her essays once more. Concentrating, George abruptly called her as she was in the middle of reviewing her essay. She went completely still. "Molly, there's some fresh fruits on the table if you want. I cut some oranges too." Yeah, sure. I'll be right there." As George called Molly to the kitchen, he can sense her nervous tone. He likes it when a girl is nervous around him. Molly entered the kitchen. She smelled like freshly picked roses, and her cheeks were blushing. George used to wear a shirt, but from that day he saw Molly's reaction when she saw him naked, he made it a hobby to go topless every day. "I freshly picked the oranges from your mom's garden," he proudly said. "They sure look sweet this year." "I know you saw us the other day," he said promptly. Molly almost choked because of what George said. George walked closer to her, eyes locked into her. His gaze was different. His eyes were full of desire and hunger, like a starved predator craving for flesh. "And I know what you did in your room." Molly walked away from him. When he would go one step closer to her, Molly would go one step back away from him. She warned him not to come closer, but he got a hold of her hand. Molly's head said run, but her heart was pounding like crazy and can't seem to move. "I know what you want. You want me to try you, right?" George said. I don't know about this. He abruptly cut her off and began kissing her on the lips. She was shy at first, but after a few kisses, their tongues were exploring each other's mouths. He dragged Molly to the sofa and kissed her from the nape of her neck to the base of her spine. George was snacking on her at the time, and he appeared overjoyed to lick every inch of her. "This is wrong," Molly said and tried to push him away. "But it feels good, right, Molly?" George said in a husky voice. George indulged every part of Molly. He let his hands explore her entire body. He loved her smooth skin, and he began imagining him biting into it like soft butter. He took every piece of cloth that preventing him from enjoying the entire view. Molly liked this, and so did George. They were enjoying each other's body. Skin to skin, sweat covered their entire bodies, and George's whole being was gladly exploring Molly's lady parts. Molly moved on top of George, and they began to move in perfect coordination, like a perfectly planned beat into the night. They both awoke dizzy in the living room the next day. They were so exhausted that they couldn't make it upstairs to sleep in a proper bed. George rose to his feet and inquired about her brunch preferences. Molly grinned as she realized she was now officially attached to this guy. They decided on pancakes with fresh fruit on the side. Molly wanted to go for a walk later that day to get some fresh air. Without hesitation, George accepted. They walked in close proximity, savoring one another's company. "Race you to that tree?" Molly challenged George. "And if I win?" George asked. Another round? Molly replied seductively. Molly was ahead of George as they raced to a large maple tree. Like a cheetah chasing a rabbit, she was sprinting, but Molly slipped and wounded herself just as George was ready to beat her. She had hit her thigh on a dead branch as she fell, causing her to breathe profusely. She gazed blankly at George, but he was behaving strangely. He seemed angry, and he appeared to be struggling to maintain control. To stop the bleeding, he tore a piece of his shirt and knotted it around her thigh. He then cleaned the blood from her thigh with the remainder of his shirt. George carried Molly inside the house and into her room to make her comfortable. I'll wash up, George said and left in a hurry. That was weird, Molly thought. Then Molly began feeling thirsty and decided to walk downstairs and get a drink. She took a cautious, deliberate stride down the stairwell and into the kitchen until she noticed George through the slightly ajar door. He wasn't cleaning the shirt as she had assumed. George was squeezing the blood out of the cloth, and Molly had a clear view of what he was doing. He was squeezing every last drop out of it. George licked the dish where he had gathered a few drips of Molly's blood, and then Molly put her hand over her lips, trying not to scream. George couldn't control himself any longer. It was so long since he had tasted human blood. His figure began to change. He grew bigger and taller. His skin was then covered with rough fur. Sharp teeth began to show, and his nails were newly sharpened knives. George let out a snarl right after he shifted to his monster form. He was picking up the cloth again when he heard the door creak and saw Molly ran away to the other room. George ran after her. He tried to open the door, but it was locked, and Molly blocked it with something heavy. Molly was inside the room shaking and was terrified. She then saw George's shadow. He was leaving, and Molly felt safe. But boy, was she mistaken. With an axe, George returned and ripped the door open in a matter of seconds. Molly cried for help, but no one was listening. George was behind her, slamming her with a heavy block of wood and dragging her upstairs unconsciously. George secured her in the bed by tying her up tight and securely. He covered her lips with a rag so she couldn't scream. He tore her garments apart, exposing her naked body like an offering for a feast.
What's the problem, Molly? I thought you wanted this. You know, if it weren't for you, I should have done this to your mom that very day you arrived. If you didn't distract us and ruined everything I planned, you would have lived. Maybe.
He glared at her. Saliva was dripping between his sharp teeth. His eyes were bloody, and claws were built to rip everything that comes his way. Molly? George heard Stacy. He forgot she was coming home today. George created a plan, making him the victim of some kind of attack from robbers. To make things believable, he grabbed a knife from his pocket and sliced his skin on his forehead, arms, and belly. He then smiled at Molly and placed his finger in her mouth, telling her to hush. Stacy saw George walk down the stairs, limping, wounded, and looked very weak.
What happened? Where's my daughter? Some men got in and tried to rob the house. I tried my best to rescue Molly, but they were too many.
Her mother was so upset that she fell on her knees and sobbed. She was particularly concerned about her daughter's safety. George moved closer to her and began to console her. She was about to believe everything, until she noticed a little knife hanging to his pocket. She tried not to express her concerns by looking at his face. The cuts on his face were not made by chance. She could finally tell they were done on purpose. She pulled George away and screamed at him.
Where's Molly?
Despite this, George refused to respond and denied all knowledge of Molly. The mother attempted to flee upstairs, but George pulled her hair and stopped her. She fell to the ground and glared angrily at George. She snatched the knife from his pocket and repeatedly stabbed his feet. She dashed upstairs, searching for her daughter. She went through each room until she came upon Molly, who was bound in her bed and wailing for aid. Molly's arms were bruised and her wound was swelling, so she untied her daughter right away. They could hear George growling. Her mother looked at Molly, perplexed by what she had heard.
That was George, Mom.
Scared and crying while saying it. They both used heavy objects to block the entrance, preventing George from entering the room. They attempted to flee by climbing down the emergency exit near the window, but the furniture used to block the entrance dispersed, and the door was broken apart. George stands there in his hairy monster form. The sight of Molly and her mother had him drooling. He snatched Molly's mother from her seat and tossed her to the opposite side of the room. Molly was terrified, but she had an idea. She bolted out of the door, and George chased after her. Molly remembered the enormous cage in the basement, and she thought that if she could imprison George there, they'd have more time to escape. She went downstairs and turned off all the lights. She came across a lantern and used it to lure George. Molly then was sitting in the basement floor, crying and looking like she was giving up, and he couldn't wait any longer. The cage in front of Molly is completely unknown to George. It was open on one side and merely waiting for his arrival. He approached Molly and stood in front of her, claws outstretched, fangs sharp and ready to attack. He was going to attack Molly and dismember her when Molly sprayed a large amount of insecticide in his face, kicked him, falling inside the cage and trapping him. She locked it fast and ran upstairs to get her mom. She was unconscious when Molly saw her. Molly waked her up and told her they have to escape fast. Her mom asked where George was, and she told her that he's trapped in the cage at the basement. Molly's mom ran downstairs. She was confused and thought that her mother would rescue that monster and take it with them, but no. Her mother pulled out gallons of gasoline and started pouring it everywhere in the house.
Let's burn the house down. He should be dead before we leave.
They both went inside the basement and started pouring gasoline everywhere.
Honey? What's going on?
George said as he began to transform back into his human form. He begged Stacy to let him go. He was acting like he was controlled by the monster and that it wasn't him that attacked them. Molly thought her mother believed what George was saying. She came closer to George, touched the cage, and looked him straight in the eyes.
Go to hell.
And splashed him with gasoline. George roared and was fuming mad. Molly and her mother ran out of the house and set the whole house on fire. They watched it burn down as they heard George screaming inside. They both hugged each other and was so relieved that they survived. Both of them got inside the car and drove away. Her mother learned a lesson that night, to never let any men enter her life that easily. And Molly? Well, she told herself that not all hot men are worth the risk.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.